This class is divided into two chunks. First, we'll be painting by hand with watercolor. Then, we'll be working on the computer in Photoshop. So for the watercolors, I'm keeping it pretty simple today. I've pulled a few pans right here from my Winsor & Newton professional watercolor set. So the full set is up in here with a lot of different colors, and I decided, again, let's keep the palette pretty simple, and I just pulled these four. The four colors that I pulled are Cobalt Turquoise Light, Indigo, Cadmium Orange, and Opera Rose. So these are the four colors I'm using, but I encourage you to follow along with whatever color palette speaks to you. So as you're choosing your colors, I would definitely encourage you to consider more of a minimal color palette. I'm only choosing four colors here, but even the orange and the pink go really well together, and the indigo and the turquoise, again, pair really well together. So less is always better than more when it comes to sophisticated color palettes with watercolor. So maybe just choose a small handful of colors to work with. And you actually don't even have to use watercolors if you're following along. Every single step of turning your hand-drawn illustration into a seamless pattern is going to be the exact same regardless of your medium. So you can use watercolors like I'm using, or you could follow along using colored pencils, markers, acrylic, gouache, even Procreate illustrations if you'd like. I actually draw a lot of my elements on my iPad using Procreate, and then I'll bring them into Photoshop later on to arrange into a seamless pattern. So you can choose your own art medium to follow along with today, and I'll be demonstrating with my favorite, which is watercolor. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close this, since I know these are the four colors I'll be using. More fun stuff. Brushes. So when it comes to watercolor brushes, I'm not an elitist by any means. This is a pack of brushes that I found on Amazon. They come down to about $1 per brush, so they're pretty cheap. So instead of talking about brands I look for, I'm going to talk about the attributes that I look for in a good watercolor brush. So first and foremost, they should be labeled as watercolor brushes. And a watercolor brush is a kind of brush that is going to hold a lot more water in the bristles than a standard acrylic or oil painting brush. So if you're, I'm just dropping all my supplies today. So if you're shopping for watercolor brushes, just make sure that you're looking specifically for watercolor brushes. So let's talk about sizes for these brushes. My smallest brush right here is actually a size 1. My medium brush is a size 5. And then this guy right here, which is my bigger brush, is actually a size 9. And if you're wondering what this giant brush right here is, this is the brush that I use to erase the pencil marks off the page when I'm finished erasing. I actually even use this on my scanner to clean the scanner bed if there's like little bits of dust and particles on there. So I don't actually paint with this brush. It's just my archaeologist brush for removing imperfections from my paper and the scanner. All right, next up, pencil and eraser. So I like using these click erasers because you can get a lot more fine-tuned with the way you erase. It's like erasing with a pencil. It feels very intuitive to hold. So if I'm erasing really tight detail areas, these click erasers are really great for that. And the other eraser I use is my kneaded eraser. So this is just kind of a gummy eraser. It's kind of like silly putty. And the way that I use this is for lightening my sketch on my paper. So when I finished sketching my composition, what I'll do is I'll take my kneaded eraser and just simply blot it on the page like this, which will help lighten my overall sketch. So with watercolor, once your paint is over those pencil marks, you can no longer erase it. You can always erase pencil marks that are just purely on your paper with no paint over them, but as soon as paint goes over those pencil marks and dries, you won't be able to erase them later. So for that reason, it's really important to make sure that your sketch is as light as possible. So the lighter the sketch, the less likely it's going to show up in your final painting. So, speaking of that, that is why I use a very hard lead pencil. 3H is a pretty hard lead pencil, which means if I'm barely making a mark on my page, it's barely going to show up. So the name of the game with watercolor, again, is to make sure that those pencil marks aren't showing through very prominently in your paintings. A little bit is always okay, but if they're really, really dark pencil marks, it could compromise the effect of your watercolor. So again, for that reason, I prefer hard lead pencils because the mark will barely show up on the page as I draw. This lead is very, very hard. And hard lead is indicated by H. So anything that has an H on it, a 3H, 5H, 1H, that's all going to mean hard lead pencils. And for me, I found that 3H is kind of my sweet spot. So this is what I'll be using today to actually do our sketch. Next up with painting is the water dish. So I'm just going to be using a mug. This is actually one of my designs that I have sold on Society6, and it makes for a fantastic coffee in the morning as well as water dish when I'm painting in the afternoon. One thing to think about with water dishes is you don't want to drink the paint water. It's really gross, and if you have like a tea over here and your water dish over here, it can be really easy to grab the wrong thing and take a sip. So don't do that. And one way that I remind myself that this is a water dish, do not drink, is I put a little piece of tape over the top. And since I started doing this, it has massively cut down on my paint water consumption. So a little pro tip for you today. And last but not least, the final art supply that you'll need for the painting portion of this class is paper. So I'm going to be painting with watercolor, so I'm using watercolor paper, and that's actually really important. So with watercolor, there's a lot of water on the pigment as you're painting with your brush, so the thicker the paper, the better for you. So what I look for in watercolor paper is, one, it is designated as watercolor paper. That's the most important thing. If it says it's watercolor paper, that means that it can handle having all of that paint and water on a brush on the page. It's not going to buckle and bend. It'll be durable and able to withstand your watercolor. I prefer using a 300 series, which is kind of mid-range in terms of thickness within your watercolor paper. 100 is very light, thin paper. I think it goes up to 500, and that's the heaviest weight watercolor paper. 100 is a little bit cheaper. 500 or 600 is the most expensive. But again, 300 is my sweet spot because I don't use a ton of water on my page. So if you're a watercolor artist and you always find that your paper is bending and buckling, maybe you need to up that series and go to the next higher level and see if that's better for you. But for me, 300 is the way to go. And the last thing I'm going to point out with watercolor paper is I look for cold press watercolor paper. And what that means is the paper is a little bit bumpier and has more of a tooth to it. Hot press will be very smooth watercolor paper. Cold press is bumpy. I love that texture, so I always go for bumpy, which is cold press. And in terms of the size of your watercolor paper, I usually paint on 11 by 15. That's kind of my comfort zone. I know some artists that prefer smaller pads of paper, some that prefer much larger. I recommend just using whatever works best for you and your painting style. And one more thing I want to mention with painting, paper towels will be your best friend. I smear and spill and smudge my paints all the time, and people think watercolors are very unforgiving, which they totally can be. But by getting to spills fast enough, you can actually remedy a lot of those mistakes as soon as they happen. So I'll be showing you how to do that as well in the painting portion of this class. But for now, paper towels, have them on hand. Now, the second portion of this class is all happening on your computer screen. So first of all, you'll need something to digitize your paintings. I'm actually going to be using a scanner. This is a V19 Epson photo scanner. And if you don't have a scanner, you can also use a camera or your phone. For professional surface design, scanners are best because they will capture the highest resolution images. But if you're just curious about how to make patterns and you want to have fun and explore, don't feel like you have to go splurge on a scanner, you can always just use a camera or your phone instead. The techniques that you'll be learning later on in Photoshop are universal no matter what you use to digitize your artwork, whether it's a phone, a scanner, or your camera. So diving a little deeper into scanners, my favorite brand of scanners is definitely Epson. Epson usually releases a new model of their photo scanner every year. So mine is the V19. I bought it in 2020. So there's definitely going to be a newer, better, more improved version out there by now. So whether you're using your phone, camera, scanner, we'll get more into that digitizing later, and I'll be covering all three bases. So just to make sure you have some sort of device that can capture your artwork and digitize it to be playing with later on in Photoshop. So speaking of Photoshop, that's the next supply you'll need. So you want to have an updated version of Photoshop up and running on your computer as well. And if you don't have Photoshop, no worries, you can actually download a free trial online. So I provided a link down below so that you can score that as well. And now for the goodies. So just for taking my class today, you are getting a ton of freebies. These freebies are totally optional in this class. Think of them like an extra perk. You're welcome to download these freebie assets to use today, or you can follow along and complete your class project using your own personal favorite textures. It's entirely up to you. Either way, you're going to wind up with a gorgeous class project. You'll get a high-res watercolor paper texture. This is what I use in my own professional artwork. Plus, you'll get a bundle of metallic textures so that you can infuse some shimmer and shine into your designs. I've included metallic textures as a freebie for some of my other classes, but this is the first time that I'm including these glitter metallics. These are actually sheets of glitter paper that I have scanned into my computer at a very high resolution and optimized specifically for today's class. They are all sized to fit your canvas perfectly. And don't worry, we'll actually be getting into exactly how to use these textures later on in today's class. I have all of these freebie files ready for you to download on Dropbox. Just go to catcoke.com/seamless and you'll be able to access all of the bonus freebies just by typing in your name and email. This will also unlock access to my newsletters where I share, you guessed it, even more freebies. Also updates and artist resources to help you along with your creative journey. And last but not least, I want this class to be as accessible as possible. So I'm giving you permission, if you'd like to skip ahead to the second portion of this class, which is all about turning your watercolor illustrations into a seamless pattern in Photoshop. So if you want to use your own hand-drawn illustrations and then just skip ahead straight to that part, you're very welcome to do so. But of course, I definitely encourage you to follow along with the watercolor portion as well, because that's where I'll be sharing my best tips for choosing motifs that are very strong sellers, creating our elements in the most optimal method, especially for seamless patterns, and my professional advice for painting in a way that's going to make that digitizing portion of this class so much easier. So my recommendation is definitely sticking with me from start to finish of this class. All right, let's dive straight in, starting with choosing your subject matter.